A racist woman pointed a finger at Big Shaq, accusing him of stealing the snowblower that had cleared her own walkway, his own snowblower. What began as one false accusation cracked open the icy mask of a perfect neighborhood. But this wasn't just about snow, it was about what's buried beneath it. When truth met power in silence, the world couldn't believe what happened next. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning, and it all started in one quiet driveway. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The snow had fallen quietly overnight, tucking the neighborhood into a soft white stillness. The kind of stillness that belonged to early winter mornings. In Cedar Pines, a gated community nestled 20 miles outside the city. The homes were trimmed in ivy and confidence, each driveway wide and winding, lined with tidy rows of hedges that whispered generational wealth. It was 6:30 a.m. when the quiet began to shift. Big Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal to the world, but just Shaq to his neighbors, stepped out onto his front porch with a thermal mug in one hand and a satisfied sigh rising with the steam. He wore a heavy black parka snow boots built like tanks and a wool beanie that sat slightly lopsided on his bald head. In the soft crunch of snow underfoot, he moved with ease despite his towering frame. He surveyed his yard, white everywhere, untouched snow like clean canvas. And there she was, his snowblower. His pride and joy, big, red, and twice the size of anyone else's in the neighborhood. He'd named her Roxy after his grandmother. Just like Grandma Roxy, this machine never quit early, never made excuses. Shaq turned the key and the engine rumbled to life. The sound broke the stillness in a way that somehow felt comforting, like the morning was finally beginning. He angled Roxy toward the edge of his driveway and got to work. This was his ritual. Clearing not only his own driveway but also the walkways of his elderly neighbors, the widow down the street, the family with newborn twins. He did it without fanfare, without needing thanks. By the time the sun was peeking past the pines, he'd already finished his own yard and was moving on to his third neighbor's sidewalk. The residents of Cedar Pines knew Shaq, not as the towering NBA legend with 5 rings and a media empire, but as the guy who brought his own tools to fix a squeaky porch hinge, who handed out Halloween candy dressed as a bumblebee, who'd show up to neighborhood meetings with homemade brownies no one had the guts to criticize. But not everyone in Cedar Pines saw it that way. From behind frosted bay windows, Dolores Whitmore watched him. Her living room overlooked the street, her curtains parted just enough to see but not be seen. She sipped her coffee slowly, her lip curling at the sight of Shaq pushing his snowblower up Mrs. Kellerman's walk like he owned the whole block. She'd lived here for over 30 years, long enough to believe she'd earned the right to speak plainly about who did and didn't belong. In her eyes, kindness had rules. Kindness stayed within boundaries, behind closed doors, and certainly didn't wear gold chains or laugh too loud at community potlucks. To Dolores, Shaq's presence was unsettling. His generosity felt performative, suspicious, like he was trying to earn his place on a street he should have been grateful just to enter. She'd never said it aloud, but her smile never reached her eyes when she waved at him, and lately she'd stopped waving altogether. That morning something in her snapped. At exactly 7:04 a.m., as Shaq paused in front of the Whitmore residence, wiping his brow and preparing to clear her sidewalk, Dolores flung open her front door with force that startled the neighborhood dogs. He looked up, blinking snowflakes from his lashes. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he called out with a smile. But her response wasn't a greeting. "What do you think you're doing with that machine?" she demanded, stepping out in slippers and a bathrobe, her voice cracking through the cold air like glass. Shaq tilted his head, confused. "Just clearing your walk. Figured I'd give you a head start today." "I didn't ask for your help," she snapped, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "And that's not your machine. That belongs to the neighborhood maintenance shed." There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretches like taut string before it snaps. Shaq blinked. "Ma'am, this snowblower's mine. Bought it 2 winters ago. Got the receipt in my garage if you want it." Dolores scoffed, her voice rising. "Don't lie to me. I saw you. You were in the shed last night." He frowned, wheels turning. "I was in there. Dropped off salt bags for the walkways. Mr. Linwood asked me to help restock." "That's convenient, isn't it?" she said coldly. "A man like you just happens to be around when things go missing." And just like that, the cold wasn't just in the air. It was in her tone, her words, her eyes. It wasn't about a snowblower anymore. It was about something older, something festering. Shaq stood still, the rumble of Roxy humming low beside him. A few neighbors had started peeking from windows. The confrontation was already traveling through whispers and texts. He could feel the tightness in his chest. Not anger, though it flirted at the edges, but disappointment, sadness even. Because this wasn't new. Because no matter how many cookies he baked, how many toys he donated, how many driveways he cleared, there would always be someone like Dolores waiting to remind him that kindness doesn't earn immunity. He took a breath. Dolores, he said slowly, you can call the HOA, call the police if you want. They'll tell you the truth, but I won't argue with you in the snow. You think you're above the rules? She said, stepping closer, her voice trembling now with something deeper fear perhaps, or the realization she'd misjudged her control of the moment. I think, he said quietly, you're scared of a story you made up. Then he turned Roxy off and started pushing her back toward his garage. The tension didn't break. It just shifted. By 8 a.m., the Cedar Pines group chat was ablaze. Some defended Dolores, claiming maybe she was confused. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Others were furious, heartbroken that Shaq, gentle, dependable Shaq, had been accused of theft with no evidence. No pause. At 10 a.m., doorbell cams began circulating. Footage of Shaq helping Dolores carry groceries last month. Of him dropping salt bags off at the shed exactly as he'd said. Calm, helpful. Always with that same easy smile. By noon, a small group of residents gathered at his door. Not to lecture, not to apologize on her behalf, but just to be there, quietly, as neighbors, as humans. Shaq opened the door, still in his boots. He didn't say much, just stepped aside so they could come in from the cold. Dolores never apologized, not directly. But the next morning, her driveway was cleared. Not by Shaq, not by any neighbor. By a hired crew, silent and sterile. The snow came again the following week, heavier this time. Shaq was out at dawn, Roxy roaring, the cold biting his cheeks. He cleared the Kellerman's walk, the trans steps, the old swing set by the neighborhood park. He skipped Dolores's driveway. And when he turned the corner, a surprise waited. 4 other neighbors, each with their own snowblower, each smiling, ready to help. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Sometimes it just shows up. Quiet, consistent, and impossible to ignore. The snow had thickened by morning, heavier than the forecasts had predicted. The sky hung low, gray and swollen, and every branch and rooftop in Cedar Pines carried the burden of it. The air was quiet again, but not peaceful, more like a hush before something was said, or done. Inside house number 7, Dolores Whitmore stood behind her living room window, a steaming cup of peppermint tea warming her trembling fingers. The tea had been her routine for years, 2 teaspoons of honey, stirred clockwise. But this morning she barely tasted it. Her eyes were locked on a figure across the street, bundled head to toe in dark winter gear, heavy gloves, a thick hoodie with the hood pulled up, wide snow pants, boots that crunched the powder with every step. He moved deliberately, his motions smooth but strong, clearing a long driveway with a machine that rumbled low like a muscle car. The red paint of the snowblower gleamed through the flurries. New, unmistakably high-end. It cut through the snow like butter, revealing cobblestone beneath. She squinted, but couldn't place him. The bulky clothing masked any familiar features, and the swirling snow didn't help. Something about the way he moved, efficient, unhurried, made her uneasy. And that machine, no one else on the street had one like it. Her eyes narrowed. Her neighbor, Chet Morrigan, stepped out to collect his newspaper, bundled in a robe and scarf. Dolores opened her door slightly and called out before she had time to think better. Chet, come here for a second. Chet shuffled over, his breath visible in bursts. Everything all right, Dee? She glanced toward the figure and leaned in. You know who that is? She asked, in a low voice, nodding toward the hooded man. Chet looked, shielding his eyes against the wind. Looks like Shaq, no? Dolores frowned. Shaq doesn't have a red snowblower. The HOA keeps theirs in the maintenance shed. It was there yesterday. Now it's not. Chet scratched his beard. You sure it's not just him in his winter gear? I'm sure of what I saw, Dolores said. And I don't think that's his property. The words came out with precision, hushed but weighted. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Accusation, when whispered just right, always finds an audience. Chet shifted uncomfortably. You think he stole it? Dolores shrugged. The way someone does when they don't want to say yes but desperately need you to believe it anyway. I'm just saying it looks suspicious. Who clears their own driveway that early with a machine that fancy? And where'd he even get it? Chet said nothing, but he didn't walk away either. That was enough for Dolores. Inside again, she reached for her phone. Non-emergency line, she told herself. Just a check. A concern. Better safe than sorry. The dispatcher took her name and asked for details. Dolores kept her voice calm, her tone practiced. There's someone in our neighborhood using a snowblower that doesn't belong to them. Possibly taken from the community shed. I'm just concerned. We've had break-ins before, and I don't want to assume, but she never said theft, never said suspicious person. But she let the silence hang just long enough between her words that the person on the other end filled in the blanks. Across the street, Shaq was finishing up his driveway. His breath fogged the air with each exhale, and his hands tingled from the cold, even through the gloves. He pulled his hood down as he stepped back to admire the clean lines of snow he'd carved away. Behind him, a garage door opened. It belonged to Linwood, head of the HOA, and one of the few people who never treated Shaq like he had to prove himself. The older man gave a friendly nod. That machine's a beast, Linwood said with a grin. Shaq chuckled. Worth every penny. Got it tuned last month. She hums now. Linwood came closer. Dolores was asking about the maintenance shed. Thought maybe something was missing. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That old salt spreader with the broken wheel? Linwood shrugged. I told her you dropped off the new salt bags last night. Still, she's Dolores. Shaq didn't respond right away. He looked down the street, fresh snow everywhere, softening the edges of the world, and then back toward Dolores's house. The curtains had shifted. Later that morning, a police cruiser turned onto Cedar Pines Drive. It didn't have lights flashing, didn't speed or swerve. It came like a shadow does, slow, quiet, certain. Officer Brianna Mendez stepped out, adjusting her beanie as she looked up at the cloudy sky. Her breath came out sharp in the cold. She checked the house numbers, then walked up the drive toward Shaq, who was now clearing Linwood's walkway. Shaq looked up, surprised but not startled. Morning, he greeted her, cutting the machine's engine. Morning, Officer Mendez replied, her voice neutral. Got a call about a concern. Mind if I ask you a couple questions? Shaq nodded, brushing snow from his gloves. About the blower? She paused. Yeah. You mind showing me a receipt or proof of purchase? Garage is open, he said simply. It's hanging on the wall. Serial numbers there too. Officer Mendez followed him to the garage. It took less than a minute to confirm everything. That your name? She asked, pointing at the paperwork. Yes, ma'am. Bought it after the last big freeze. Got tired of waiting on the HOA's rusty one. Mendez gave a small nod, her professionalism unwavering. Sorry for the trouble. Just had to follow up. No trouble, Shaq said. But he didn't smile. As she turned to leave, her radio crackled. She lifted it to her ear and murmured a response before pausing. Then she looked back at Shaq. If it's all right, can I ask one more thing? Do you know Dolores Whitmore? Shaq looked over her shoulder toward the house with the lace curtains pulled tightly shut. I know of her, he said. We've exchanged waves. Sometimes. Mendez nodded again, then left without further comment. But Shaq stood there for a long time after she was gone, Roxy silent by his side. That evening, as the sky turned a soft blue and the snow began to fall again, the neighborhood buzzed. Not openly. No one said anything outright, but conversations sparked like friction. At mailboxes, in driveways, in group chats that pinged with carefully phrased observations. Did you hear what happened with Shaq? Wasn't he just helping out again? Who would even think he stole something? Well, you know, Dolores. The words swirled, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Shaq didn't respond to any of it. He stayed inside after sunset, made soup from scratch, called his cousin in Florida, and played a slow jazz record that crackled like a fire. But in his chest a question pulsed. How many kind gestures does it take to erase one whisper? The next morning, a note appeared on his porch. Handwritten, unsigned. We see you. We stand with you. Let us know how to help. By noon, 3 teenagers from down the block showed up at his door, asking if they could help with the next round of snow. Shaq smiled, nodded, handed one of them Roxy's handle, and pointed to Mrs. Tran's sidewalk. Dolores from her window watched it all. She didn't call again. Not because she regretted it, but because the silence that followed spoke louder than any whisper she'd ever made. And that silence, the one filled with truth, discomfort, and the slow crumbling of certainty, settled over the neighborhood like fresh snow, covering everything, even the parts no one wanted to see. Because in Cedar Pines, the snow never stayed white for long. Cedar Pines had always worn its silence, like a badge. It was the kind of neighborhood where the snow fell evenly, where driveways curved like carefully drawn cursive, and where arguments rarely made it past passive-aggressive newsletter complaints. But this morning the silence broke, not with a scream or siren, but with the slow, steady hum of a police cruiser rolling in over white snow. The blue lights weren't flashing wildly, just spinning gently, casting soft glows against the banks of white. Almost like a warning whispered instead of shouted. A soft disruption to a picture-perfect morning. Big Shaq had just finished the Tran family's driveway. His gloves were damp, his breath visible in short, tired clouds. The cold clung to his face, and the snowblower, Roxy, sat beside him, humming low and steady. He was about to turn toward Miss Kellerman's steps, when he heard the slow crunch of tires on frozen gravel. He looked up. One cruiser, then a second. The street, already brushed with rumors from the day before, inhaled. Shaq's brow furrowed, not with fear but with something heavier. Recognition. He'd been here before, not in this exact moment, not on this block or in this context, but he knew the feeling, that sudden shift in air pressure, that sense of being seen, not as a neighbor or man or even person, but as a possibility, a question mark. Two officers stepped out. One was Officer Mendez, from the day before. The other a taller man, new to the scene, his uniform stiff with protocol. Shaq turned off the machine and removed his gloves, letting them hang from the clips on his wrists. He didn't move toward them. He simply stood beside the snowblower, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. Officer Mendez gave a small nod. Mr. O'Neill. He nodded back. Officer. The taller one spoke. We got another call this morning. Same concern as yesterday. Alleged unauthorized use of property. Shaq didn't flinch. You got the paperwork yesterday. It's still in the garage. We'd like to take another look if you don't mind. The tall officer replied, tone polite but firm. The kind of voice trained to sound calm even when suspicion simmered underneath. Shaq gestured toward the open garage door. Help yourself. Receipts pinned. Serial numbers there. Linwood from HOA already confirmed it's mine. As Mendez walked toward the garage, the taller officer remained near Shaq, glancing occasionally at the snowblower. You clear all these driveways yourself? Most of them, Shaq replied. Some neighbors help. Roxy here does the heavy lifting. You always use this machine. Shaq looked at him. I only own one. From down the street, a door opened. Then another. Eyes peeked out, then stayed out. It was subtle. People stepping onto porches under the guise of checking the mail, or brushing off railings. But soon, they were watching openly. And then, someone lifted a phone. Shaq saw the lens. It didn't make him bristle or stiffen. Instead, he just shifted slightly so his profile caught the light, his face clear. If they were going to record, they could record the whole man, not a silhouette, not a shadow, not a shape in the snow. Mendez returned, holding the laminated receipt like it was a sacred document. Matches the model. Matches the tag on the unit. It's clean, she said to her partner. The taller officer nodded, but he didn't leave. He looked at Shaq, then at the surrounding homes, then back again. You understand, he began. We had to respond, given the nature of the calls. What nature is that? Shaq asked, his voice calm, not raised, not biting, just curious and tired. The officer paused. Concern about property theft. Report said the individual didn't appear to belong. The caller didn't recognize you. Didn't recognize me? Shaq echoed. He glanced at his own house, the one with his name on the mailbox, the one where he'd hosted block parties and charity raffles and birthday barbecues, the one where kids still left crayon drawings in his mailbox, signed, Thanks, Mr. Shaq. Winter gear, Mendez offered, like it might explain it away. Can make people look different. Sure, Shaq said softly. Or maybe some people see exactly what they expect. The words weren't directed at them, not entirely. He said it more to the cold air, to the neighbors gathered, to the lens recording, to the quiet in all its complicit forms. A voice called out from a nearby porch. He's cleared my driveway every week since December. Mrs. Tran stepped out, boots crunching as she came down the steps. Same here, added Linwood, now standing at the end of his driveway. That's his snowblower. He's used it for years. More voices joined. Not yelling. No one screamed. It was quieter than protest. It was truth laid bare, offered plainly. Neighbor to neighbor, witness to witness. The officer gave a tight nod, then turned to Shaq again. We appreciate your cooperation. Shaq nodded. You need anything else? No, Mendez said gently. We're done here. As the officers walked back to the cruiser, the cameras kept rolling. Not just one phone now. 3, 4, 5. Not for drama, not to bait the moment. But because this was a moment they didn't want twisted or lost. Proof that sometimes the truth wears work gloves and boots in clear snow while the world waits to question it. The cruisers pulled away slowly, blue lights flickering like the tail end of a storm. Shaq didn't go inside right away. He turned to Roxy, wiped the frost from her handles, and started her back up. The machine roared, not angrily, just steadily, just like always. He moved to the Kellerman driveway, hands steady, motions smooth, as if nothing had changed, as if everything had. Neighbors slowly returned to their homes. Some approached him hands in pockets, hesitant but sincere. You all right? One asked. Need anything? Another offered. Shaq just smiled. It was faint but real. I need to finish the job, he said, and returned to work. From her window, Dolores watched. Her curtains drawn just enough for a glimpse. Her face, unreadable. She didn't come out. She didn't say a word. But the silence no longer belonged to her. Later that evening, someone left a thermos of hot cider on Shaq's porch. No note, just a quiet offering. Then someone else shoveled his walkway before he could. Linwood arranged a neighborhood meeting that night, not to talk about bylaws, but about assumption, about what was owed between neighbors, about the weight of silence. And through it all, Shaq said little. He didn't need to, because some truths don't need to be shouted. They don't need to be argued or defended or written in bold. Sometimes they just need to be lived out loud. On white snow, under blue lights, with hands steady, on a snowblower, and a heart that keeps showing up even when the world asks it not to. The video was only 93 seconds long, shot vertically, a little shaky at first, with muffled audio from the wind and the low hum of a snowblower in the background. But what it captured, what it implied, was louder than anything the camera could have recorded. It began with Big Shaq standing beside his red snowblower, in a cloud of soft falling snow, surrounded by officers. One was flipping through a laminated receipt, the other shifting uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about what he was even doing there. The man at the center, tall, calm, familiar to millions, stood still, saying little, his breath visible in the cold. The caption read, "Millionaire athlete accused of stealing his own snowblower in suburban neighborhood." Uploaded anonymously. It spread like a spark on dry grass. Within 6 hours, it had 2.7 million views. By the end of the day, it was playing on morning news segments across the country. Local news, national commentary, influencer reaction videos. Some reposted the clip with captions like, "This is what quiet racism looks like." Others were less generous. "Why didn't he just show ID?" Or, "This is why people don't trust celebs." By the second morning, it had a name, a tag, a narrative bigger than the man it began with. Snowblower. And just like that, the man who had spent years living quietly in a small, affluent neighborhood, the man who fixed fences, handed out scholarships, and shoveled snow without being asked, was no longer just a neighbor. He was a headline, a controversy, a symbol. But the symbol was never his choice. Back in Cedar Pines, Shaq stood in his kitchen, phone silent on the counter. He'd turned off notifications by 9 a.m. The first wave was easy to ignore. But when his lawyer called, then his agent, then 3 media outlets requesting interviews, it became harder to pretend the storm outside hadn't followed him indoors. He sipped black coffee, eyes fixed on the television screen, where 2 anchors debated his intentions like sportscasters calling a game. Shouldn't the police be allowed to investigate a claim if someone calls them? Yes, but context matters. Would they have done this if it was a white man in ski gear and gloves? Do we know what the neighbors saw? Does it matter? He turned the volume down. It wasn't rage he felt. Not yet. It was something else deeper. The kind of weight that doesn't crush but erodes slowly, like water on stone. In the next room, his daughter Miara sat curled on the couch, knees to her chest, watching the video on repeat. She hadn't said much that morning. When she first saw it online, it took her 3 full minutes to realize it wasn't just someone like her dad. It was him, that driveway, that snowblower, his shoulders, his boots. Her silence had been louder than any scream. "You okay, baby?" he asked from the doorway. She nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the screen. "I knew this kind of stuff happened," she murmured. "We learned about it. I've seen other people talk about it. But I never thought—" She trailed off. He stepped closer. "Never thought it'd be me." She shook her head. "Never thought it'd be us. In our neighborhood. Just clearing snow." Shaq sat beside her. "We've always been almost. To some folks. Almost safe. Almost welcome. Almost equal. Doesn't take much to remind them. You're still just visiting in their eyes." She looked up at him. "And now everyone's watching. What do? We stay who we are," he said simply. "We don't shrink." But staying who he was proved harder than it sounded. By noon, 2 of his brand sponsors had paused campaigns. Not dropped him, not officially, but emails started arriving with soft phrases like "let's hold off on the next rollout," and "we're reevaluating our messaging for this quarter." Talk show invitations flooded in. Everyone wanted a soundbite. Some wanted outrage. Others wanted reconciliation. One network offered to fly Dolores Whitmore in for a joint segment. Shaq declined them all. This wasn't a moment for theater, not for packaged healing or token apologies. It wasn't a viral misunderstanding. It was what it had always been, an exposure of truth, long known, now inconveniently visible. And the world wasn't sure how to handle it. Online, the video splintered into 1,000 takes. Celebrities reposted it with comments like "enough is enough." Anonymous trolls mocked his silence with gifs and laugh emojis. Activist groups quoted him, even though he hadn't said a word publicly. Neighborhood gossip pages argued over whether Dolores had meant any harm. Meanwhile, Shaq just kept shoveling snow. That evening, a documentary filmmaker emailed asking if they could fly in for an interview. She promised nuance, promised control of the narrative. He read it twice, then deleted it. The truth didn't need help being complicated. By day 3, the pressure reached Mamura School. A classmate posted a meme referencing the video. A teacher asked if she was okay in front of the whole class. A local journalist camped across from the school gate in a car with tinted windows. Shaq picked her up early, saying only, "Let's take a snow day." They drove for 2 hours outside the city, past frozen rivers and through pine-lined roads. She didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't explain. Eventually, they stopped at a quiet overlook where snow blanketed the ground in untouched waves. "This is where I used to run drills," he said. "Way before NBA. When I was just some tall, quiet kid with a lot of energy and not a lot of friends." Mira climbed out of the truck and followed him into the open field. The cold nipped at their cheeks, but the wind was still, safe, real. "Why here?" she asked. "Because it's the only place I ever felt big without feeling like a threat," he answered. They stood in silence for a while, father and daughter, surrounded by white that didn't judge, or whisper, or record, just snow, just breath. Just being. The video kept climbing, 10 million, then 20. It made its way to late-night talk shows, was dissected by political panels, satirized in sketches, repurposed in educational webinars. Still, Shaq said nothing to the press, because every interview seemed to want a narrative arc, a rise, a fall, a redemption. But what if there was no redemption? No arc? Just the reality of a man trying to live with dignity, while the world debated if he ever had any to begin with. Dolores, for her part, remained mostly silent. Her family issued a brief statement about misunderstanding and concern for neighborhood safety, but no direct apology ever came. She didn't attend the emergency HOA meeting that Linwood organized. She didn't respond to interview requests, but her absence spoke volumes. And eventually, so did the community. By the end of the week, a group of neighbors, young, old, newly moved in and long established, stood outside Shaq's home, with signs that read, "Our neighbor, our brother. Kindness is not suspicious. Shaq, we see you." They didn't chant. They didn't yell. They just stood, present, firm, real. One by one, they helped clear snow from every sidewalk on the block. Not as a statement, as a start. Mera recorded it on her phone, not for virality, just to remember. And for the first time in days, Shaq smiled. Not faint, not polite, but real, deep. from somewhere untouched. Because the truth had gone viral. Yes. But so had the response. Not all of it ugly. Not all of it shallow. Somewhere within the noise, something small and warm had survived. Something like community. Something like clarity. And though the snow would keep falling, though the internet would move on to the next headline, one truth remained steady as ever. A man had cleared snow in his own driveway, and the world had shown up to question whether he belonged there. Now it had to reckon with the answer. The snow outside had begun to melt in places, turning to slush along the edges of the walkways and gutters. Cedar Pines was quieter now, the media van that had loitered down the street finally gone, and the porch steps free from the silent deliveries of hand-scrawled letters and store-bought sympathy. Yet inside Shaq's home, the silence remained thick, not from absence but from weight, the kind that comes not from sound, but from everything left unsaid. Shaq hadn't left the house in 2 days, not to shovel, not to wave at passing neighbors, not even to pick up the mail. The storm wasn't outside anymore. It was under his skin, the kind of storm that made him question the value of stillness, of humility, of choosing peace in a world that seemed intent on misreading it as guilt, the kind that curled into his muscles and turned his size into a burden instead of armor. He hadn't touched his phone in hours. The internet had moved on to something else, a celebrity scandal, a political shakeup, and yet his name still flickered on screen. Scrolls and hashtags, people dissecting 93 seconds of footage like it was scripture, as if they knew what stood behind his silence, as if silence was permission, as if restraint wasn't its own kind of power. When the doorbell rang, he didn't move. It rang again, but softer this time, not persistent, not impatient, just a note. Eventually he opened the door and found the envelope, sitting neatly on the mat. No postage, no name, just his address written in elegant, familiar handwriting. The ink curved with the kind of confidence that came from someone who had held their ground through storms fiercer than this one. He closed the door, sat in his reading chair, and turned the envelope over. It was from her, Lucy. His mother didn't do emails, didn't text unless it was an emergency. But when something mattered, really mattered, she wrote, ink and paper, because she believed the soul flowed better through pen than thumbs. He opened the envelope slowly, as if the paper might tear beneath his fingers. Inside was a folded page, written in blue ink, sharp and deliberate. My son, you don't have to respond to this. I didn't write it so you would. I wrote it because I know the world, and I know you. And right now the world is trying to shrink you. They'll do that, baby. They always will. They'll take one moment, one still frame, one whispered accusation, and pretend it defines you. They'll pretend they forgot your full name, your full life, your full truth. They'll call you suspect before they ever call you neighbor. But you weren't raised to fold under a stare. You weren't raised for applause either. I raised you to endure, to serve without asking for thanks, to be kind even when it's mistaken for weakness. But don't let their silence be your silence. Don't let their shame become your weight. You know who you are. You were made with purpose. You walk with ancestors behind you. People who weren't allowed to own land, to vote, to stand still in front of their own homes without being questioned. And now you are here, in a house you bought, clearing snow for people who would rather assume theft than offer thanks. That's not your burden, son. That's theirs. You hear me? That's theirs. But your story isn't finished. You are not a moment. You are not a hashtag. You are not a victim of a shaky video. You are made of whole chapters. Some painful, some glorious, but all yours. So if you're gonna hide, hide in prayer. If you're gonna be quiet, let it be, because you're building, and when you speak, and you will, let it not be for apology or rage. Let it be because you've remembered who you are. The world will try to pull you apart. I know this. I have lived this. But baby, don't you ever let them make you small. I love you. Always. Mama. By the time he reached the end, the house was still, not hollow. Still. The kind of stillness that follows something sacred, not silent. Shaq leaned back in his chair, letter open in his hands, and stared out the window. The snow was starting to fall again. But softer now, less like punishment, more like memory. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. The tears weren't necessary, not in that moment. What he felt was deeper, grounded, a pulse, steady and solid, returning to its rhythm. For days he'd been shrinking inward, retreating from a world that cheered his name in arenas but questioned his presence on sidewalks. He'd given kindness like breath, without asking, without needing credit, and watched it returned with suspicion. He'd been dissected in pixels and headlines, and somewhere in the storm of it all, he'd started to forget that he was never built to be palatable. He was built to be present. He stood slowly, letter still in hand, and walked toward the back room, the one with the photo wall. His entire life marked in black and white smiles, and full-color chaos. Championship schools funded, kids hugged, drives led, elders thanked, moments no camera crew had ever bothered to capture, but they were here, on his walls, in his skin. He placed the letter beside a photo of him and Lucille taken years ago on a church lawn, her in a wide hat, him in a suit too tight across the shoulders, both of them laughing with full chests. Then he went to the porch. Snow was settling in again. He stepped out, coat unzipped, hoodie pulled up, gloves loose in his hands. He didn't bring the snowblower this time. He didn't need to clear anything yet. He just stood there, present, unapologetic. Not a moment. Not a symbol. A chapter still being written. It started with a spreadsheet. Shaq didn't plan to dig. He wasn't interested in revenge, or exposure, or making anyone pay. He wanted peace, or at the very least, clarity. But after the letter from Lucille, after the neighbors showed up in silent protest with signs and shovels, something inside him shifted. Not in rage, in resolve. He realized the moment on the snow-covered driveway wasn't isolated. It wasn't just about Dolores, or the snowblower, or even the 93 seconds of viral footage. It was about something older, something embedded. He began to wonder, how many times had this happened before, and gone unseen? That's when he called Nolan Briggs. Nolan had lived on the far edge of Cedar Pines for over a decade. A disabled Army veteran with a sharp mind and a sharper memory. He'd once worked military intelligence before a roadside bomb left him with limited mobility. Most people in the neighborhood waved to Nolan but rarely spoke to him beyond small talk. But Shaq knew better. Nolan was the kind of man who noticed everything and said nothing until it mattered. Shaq knocked on his door just after sundown, carrying a folder under his arm. Nolan answered in his wheelchair, blanket across his lap, a raised eyebrow waiting. "Need a favor," Shaq said, offering a small smile. "You still got that HOA complaint database?" Nolan rolled back with a quiet grunt. "Come in. I knew you'd get there eventually." They sat in Nolan's cluttered office, screens glowing with layers of data. The man had archived 10 years' worth of HOA incident reports, neighbor disputes, security alerts, and emergency service calls. Nothing official, not in a legal sense, but every publicly disclosed document Nolan had saved. Shaq handed him the folder. Inside were notes, copies of the snowblower receipt, timelines from the morning of the police visit, a list of who'd texted or called after the video dropped. At the bottom, scribbled in pencil, was one name underlined twice: Dolores Whitmore. Nolan narrowed his eyes. "You want to know if this was just her, being her?" Shaq nodded. "All right," Nolan said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's pull the thread." Over the next several nights, Shaq returned. They dug into records that most neighbors had long forgotten. The names began to surface. Families who had since moved, or quietly disappeared after neighborhood tension mounted. A black couple, the Adamus, who'd left 4 years ago after being cited 6 times for excessive vehicle noise, even though they drove a hybrid. A young Latino man reported for loitering while waiting outside his girlfriend's home. A teenager accused of trespassing for cutting through a cul-de-sac shortcut, even though his own house was 2 streets away. The common thread? Every complaint had one name attached: Whitmore. Nolan clicked open a complaint from 2 years prior, a false theft report involving a landscaping crew hired by the Wilsons, an interracial couple. The crew had been surrounded by patrol cars within 10 minutes of arrival. The charges were dropped before anyone made it to court, but the crew never returned to Cedar Pines. Shaq sat back in the chair, the air around him colder than the room. "You've been sitting on this?" he asked. Nolan shrugged. "I didn't have the audience. But now you do." By week's end, they had a pattern, and not just of bias, of systemic apathy. The HOA had flagged some of Dolores's reports as unsubstantiated, but no formal action had ever been taken. No one had followed up. No one had questioned her motives. It wasn't just about one bad actor. It was about the quiet ecosystem that let her operate. Shaq decided it was time to speak, but not through headlines or viral videos. He chose something smaller, sharper. He requested a meeting with the HOA board. The board had expected something different. Maybe an apology, maybe a request to step back from the controversy. What they got was a presentation. Names, dates, audio from a security system that caught Dolores confronting a food delivery driver last fall, asking what his business was here at 9 p.m. Shaq spoke without raising his voice. He didn't accuse. He revealed, and every board member saw the pieces fall into place. One of them, Mrs. Huang, shifted in her seat. Why didn't anyone say anything before? Shaq met her eyes. They did. You just didn't listen loud enough. The room sat in silence, no longer the comfortable kind. After the meeting, word spread. The Adiamis were tracked down and interviewed by a local paper. Their story ran under the headline, "We Never Felt Welcome." Former residents speak out about Cedar Pines bias complaints. A whistleblower from the local sheriff's department came forward, confirming multiple 911 calls made by Dolores had been flagged as racially motivated concerns, but were still dispatched without question. Suddenly, Shaq's driveway incident wasn't just a trending video. It was Exhibit A. More neighbors came forward. Not all with horror stories, some just with questions. Why did certain homes get more random inspections than others? Why did HOA citations seem heavier toward newer, non-white residents? Why was Dolores allowed to serve on 3 subcommittees, despite being formally warned twice for false reporting? The pressure mounted. Shaq remained composed, deliberate. He wasn't looking for a headline anymore. He was after structural change. The HOA board announced an emergency town hall, open to the public. This time, it wasn't about bylaws or fences. It was about accountability. And that's when Dolores showed up. She entered the room just as it filled to capacity, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, sunglasses pushed high on her head. She didn't speak, just sat in the back, silent, unreadable. Shaq didn't acknowledge her directly. Instead, he walked to the front, nodded to Nolan, who waited in the audience, and began reading a list of names, not to shame, but to remember. Everyone who had been quietly forced out. Everyone who had been made to feel almost welcome. Then he paused. My mama once told me, he said, that we are made of whole chapters, not moments. But this neighborhood, some of you tried to shrink folks into footnotes. I won't let that happen anymore. He offered proposals. A community review board for HOA citations. Third-party oversight for security and emergency call logs. Diversity training for the board. Quarterly meetings open to all residents, not just those who looked like they'd been here long enough. Applause followed. Not raucous, but real. Dolores didn't clap, but she didn't leave, either. That night, Shaq walked home slowly. Snow had started to fall again. Gentle this time, blanketing the roads in a soft hush. Nolan called him later. That was good work, he said. It's not done, Shaq replied. And it wasn't. Because once you pull the curtain back, you don't get to walk away. You clean the room. You open the windows. You let in the air. Shaq didn't want to become a symbol. But now that he had the mic, he wasn't letting go. Not until Cedar Pines saw itself, not just in winter but clearly, even when the snow melted. Even when the cameras turned away, snow still clung to the sidewalks. Though the ice had started to recede, beneath it cracks in the pavement appeared, barely visible but spreading. Cedar Pines looked intact from a distance. Tidy lawns, polished shutters, the soft flicker of porch lights in the early dusk. But the illusion was beginning to split, and what lay beneath was no longer easy to ignore. The Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting, but this one wasn't open to everyone. Unlike the town hall Shaq had spoken at, this meeting was labeled closed session, a designation typically reserved for budget disputes or litigation threats. But now it was being used to talk about the growing unrest in the neighborhood, or more precisely, how to contain it. The email was sent under the subject, Cedar Pines Cohesion Planning. Carefully worded, neutral. Shaq didn't receive an invite. Neither did Nolan Briggs. Instead, a message arrived in Nolan's inbox from HOA President Bill Harper. Given the sensitive nature of the current climate, and your recent publication of community documents without board clearance, we ask that you refrain from attending this session. Shaq's own notice came through a back channel, not from the board, but from Mrs. Huang, who had quietly supported his presentation at the last meeting. She called him directly. They're holding a vote, she said, on whether to issue a formal HOA complaint against you and Nolan for community disruption. They won't call it retaliation, but that's exactly what it is. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and even. They think if they quiet us, this all just resets? They want to contain the fallout, keep the property values stable, prevent national attention. They're too late for that. They know, she replied. That's why they're getting sloppy. Nolan, when told, just laughed dryly. I fought insurgents in Kandahar, man. A few retired dentists and over-empowered HOA board members don't scare me. But the fractures were spreading beyond the boardroom. Across Cedar Pines, subtle tensions had begun to tighten. The good mornings were shorter. The waves from across the street now came with hesitation. There were driveways being shoveled by outside services again, instead of neighbors. The illusion of harmony, of mutual respect, was crumbling. Mira noticed it first at school. She'd returned the day after the town hall, shoulders square, face set. But even in her quiet resolve, the stares felt sharper. A classmate she'd studied with weekly was suddenly too busy to partner on the group project. Another wouldn't make eye contact in the lunch line. But what cut deepest came from a whisper she wasn't supposed to hear. In the library, two girls, both daughters of HOA committee members, hovered near a study table. My dad said she's trouble, one muttered. He said to stay clear of her house, just in case. Memera froze behind the stack of science books. She didn't say anything. She didn't confront them. She just sat there, the words folding into her chest like sharp glass, silent but unforgettable.
That night she told her father.
Shaq sat with her on the porch swing, the air brittle with wind. I thought it would feel better exposing it, she said. But it's like, now they hate us more. Quietly, he nodded. Because truth doesn't always change hearts. Sometimes it just reveals them. Meanwhile, whispers turned into conversations. A parent at the private school fundraiser told the event organizer that Mira's presence might attract attention, given the climate. The teacher relayed it to Shaq in a discreet email. No accusations, just concern. Professional, detached concern. And still, no one said it aloud. She doesn't belong here. But it hung behind every denial, every glance, every withdrawal. Across the neighborhood, lines were being drawn, but they weren't always visible. They moved like currents under a frozen lake. One evening, Shaq received a knock on the door. It was Linwood, the older HOA member who'd once greeted Shaq like family. His expression now was different, stiff, tired. Got a moment? He asked. They sat on the porch as dusk settled. They want to move forward with the complaint, Linwood said. They're calling it a neutral censure for breaching HOA trust. Nothing official, but symbolic. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Symbolic punishment for telling the truth? They're scared. About press, about lawsuits, about investors pulling out of the development expansion. And what about being scared of what they let happen here? What they allowed for years? Linwood didn't answer. He just stared out across the street at Dolores's darkened windows. There are two neighborhoods here, Shaq said. Always have been. Y'all just kept pretending the second one didn't exist. You didn't see how we were treated, because you didn't want to see it. I see it now, Linwood admitted. But I'm one vote. Shaq stood. Then vote right. Inside, Nolan was already typing up a response. Not just a defense, but a community report. With Shaq's input, he drafted a timeline of events, organized data trends on past complaints, and collected anonymous testimonies from residents of color in Cedar Pines. Some were reluctant at first, fearful. But once word got out that Shaq was collecting stories, not for revenge, but for reform, more began to speak. A retired black physician detailed how a package delivery was once held at the gate for verification. An Indian family recalled being questioned about backyard music volumes despite city ordinances being followed. Even a white resident confessed, I always thought it was weird, the way Dolores spoke about certain neighbors, but I didn't want to stir anything. Each story, alone, was small, easy to dismiss. Together, they were undeniable. Shaq and Nolan sent the report directly to the HOA and released it to the local press. The response was immediate. Some board members resigned. Others pushed back harder, claiming data manipulation and misrepresentation. Dolores remained silent, but she started keeping her blinds closed. Her car was no longer parked in front of her house. It was tucked in her garage, out of view. But the backlash wasn't limited to the board. At the community gym, someone left a sticky note on Shaq's locker. If you hate it here so much, leave. At the grocery store, a woman he'd helped load bags into her car months ago now avoided eye contact entirely. The fractures were no longer beneath the surface. They were out in the open, jagged and raw. But for every cold shoulder, There was a neighbor who leaned in. A father who offered to walk with Mamara to school. A young mother who asked Shaq to speak to her son's civic class about standing up peacefully. A teenage boy who nervously rang Shaq's doorbell, just to say, "I saw the video, I believe you." The fractures weren't just breaking the community apart. They were exposing the ones willing to help put it back together. Shaq stood in it all. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, but as a man unwilling to be reduced to a stereotype or a scapegoat. His voice remained steady, his actions measured. But inside he carried a different kind of flame now. Not anger, conviction. Because if unity meant silence, then maybe fracture was a necessary first step. Necessary to rebuild something real. Not perfect, but honestly, the envelope arrived without a return address. It was tucked between circulars and a real estate flyer in Shaq's mailbox. Plain and beige. Nothing remarkable about it except for the thickness. It was too heavy to be junk mail, and too light to be from a lawyer. There was no stamp, no postmark. Someone had hand-delivered it, sliding it in without knocking. Shaq stood under the porch light, snow flurries drifting around him, and waited in his hand. He'd seen enough to know when something didn't smell right. And this did. He brought it inside, peeled the adhesive seal open carefully, and unfolded the contents onto the dining table. At first, all he saw were black and white prints. High contrast, grainy, the kind of surveillance images that came from outdated cameras, or someone being careful. The first photo was unmistakable. Dolores Whitmore standing in the far corner of a quiet park just beyond the boundaries of Cedar Pines. She wasn't alone. Next photo, a man. Tall, in a wool coat and ball cap, pulled low. Even in grayscale, Shaq recognized the profile. The jawline, the slouched posture that always suggested disdain, like the world owed him more than it gave. Richard Cornell. A name that hadn't been said aloud in Cedar Pines for almost 2 years. He had once served on the HOA board, in charge of neighborhood image management, a fancy title that mostly meant he drafted the rules about what was allowed to be visible. Which cars, which flags, which hairstyles on kids. His language had always been clean, coded, professional, but the subtext was never hard to read. He was removed quietly after a series of complaints from younger families, those who'd moved in during the development's second phase, more diverse in culture and income. The board called it a restructuring. Some said he resigned. Others knew better. Shaq flipped through the rest of the photos. Dolores and Richard seated on a bench, then walking to a car, a black sedan, with an obscured license plate. In one image, she hands him a folder. In another, they're both pointing at something on a tablet. There was a timestamp in the bottom corner, 2 weeks before the snowblower incident. Shaq leaned back, his heart beat a slow, heavy drum. The accusation hadn't been a spontaneous act of fear or confusion. It had been calculated, plotted. The snowblower had been a spark, but someone had been stacking kindling long before that day. He picked up the envelope again. At the very bottom, folded into the inner crease, was a single handwritten note on lined paper. "They've done this before. You weren't the first. Don't let it happen again. A neighbor who sees now." No signature, no clues. But the message was clear. Shaq didn't call Nolan that night. He needed a few hours to sit with it, to let the betrayal solidify into something he could move through. He sat at the kitchen table as the house grew quiet, Myra upstairs asleep, unaware of the storm settling beneath their roof again. By morning he called in a favor. One of the quiet ones. A contact from his charity work. Someone who handled community security audits. Agreed to verify the surveillance prints. A digital forensics team matched them to traffic camera logs and gate security footage from Cedar Pines' northern entrance. The meeting between Dolores and Richard. Confirmed. The location? Just outside HOA jurisdiction, near a walking trail known only to longtime residents. Within 48 hours, it was no longer a theory. It was a pattern. Nolan arrived that evening, Shaq laying the images out on the table like cards in a quiet game of war. "Holy hell," Nolan muttered. "They were playing us the whole time." "Not us," Shaq corrected. "Everyone." As they dug deeper, a bigger picture emerged. 3 families who had sold their homes suddenly in the last 18 months. Each had reported friction with HOA enforcement. 2 had been fined repeatedly for vague infractions like yard clutter or visual disruption. Another had been denied architectural approval for a minor renovation, despite all paperwork being in order. All of them had received anonymous notices, urging them to consider relocating to a more fitting neighborhood. Now Shaq understood. The snowblower wasn't about machinery. It was a test. A way to measure how far they could push without consequence. But something had shifted since then. A phone, a video, a community no longer willing to look away. Their plan had backfired, but not completely, because the danger wasn't just in the plotting. It was in the silence that allowed it. Shaq drafted a timeline, Nolan compiled supporting documentation, and together they wrote a report titled Operation Conform, an internal pattern of coordinated bias in Cedar Pines. They sent it, not to the HOA board this time, but to the local newspaper editor, who had run the Accuses story weeks earlier. The response was immediate. Within 2 days, the story hit front pages across the county. Exposed, leaked images reveal secret network behind Cedar Pines discrimination. Names were named, incidents re-examined. Quotes from anonymous former residents layered across photos of snowy sidewalks and smiling real estate ads. For the first time, the narrative wasn't just about a celebrity being wronged. It was about community deception, systemic gatekeeping, the quiet, polished machine of suburban exclusion. Dolores was approached for comment. She refused. Her lawyer issued a brief statement denying all allegations and questioning the authenticity of the photos. But the damage had been done. Richard Kernell's name trended briefly before he scrubbed all public-facing accounts. His employer issued a statement, distancing themselves. At the next HOA meeting, 4 board members resigned. Linwood stayed, Mrs. Huang stayed, and a new resolution passed, unanimously. All future HOA disciplinary measures would be reviewed by an independent advisory committee, with community-elected representation from all neighborhood blocks. Shaq declined the offer to chair it. Instead, he nominated Nolan. "I've had enough cameras on me for a lifetime," he said. "Time for someone who watches instead of performs." Nolan accepted, smirking. Still, the fracture wasn't healed. Cedar Pines would never return to the image it once projected. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it never should. In the days that followed, neighbors walked past Shaq's house slower. Some stopped to chat, not with pity, but with a kind of respectful awareness. A few apologized, not with dramatic regret, but with simple truths. "I should have said something earlier. I saw what was happening and didn't know how to stop it. I'm listening now." Even Dolores, days later, was seen on her porch, face pale and unreadable. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply watched as children played near the cul-de-sac, laughter echoing through air that felt different, not entirely cleansed but honest. One morning, Mira found a hand-drawn poster taped to the community bulletin board near the park. It read, "Cedar Pines belongs to all of us. Let's prove it." No name, no logo, just words, just hope. Shaq stood behind her as she read it, the early sun catching on his jacket.
"You think they mean it?" she asked.
He didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the neighborhood, and then said, "We'll find out. Together." Winter was melting, and so was the illusion that Cedar Pines was ever as perfect as it looked in real estate brochures. The sidewalks were still tidy. The homes still wore their symmetry like armor. But the warmth that had returned with spring didn't feel like comfort. It felt like exposure, like sunlight finally hitting places that had stayed too cold for too long. It had been 3 weeks since the article dropped. 3 weeks since the photos of Dolores and Richard Kernell made their way from envelope to public record. 3 weeks since the HOA board fractured. Since neighbors started avoiding Dolores's house, like it carried contagion. Shaq hadn't said a word publicly. Not a press statement. Not a soundbite. The press kept reaching out, hungry for an exclusive. But Shaq wasn't interested in shaping the narrative with interviews. He wasn't trying to be a hero or a headline. He was trying to leave something better than a feud. So when he stood before the city's Community Equity Committee, with a folded check in one hand and a proposal in the other, no one expected what came next. The proposal was simple: a grassroots racial justice initiative focused on education, neighborhood mediation, and youth empowerment, to be launched locally, with pilot programming in Cedar Pines. There would be workshops, peer groups, and neighborhood liaisons, trained to de-escalate bias incidents before they ever reached a 911 call. The funding was enough to run it for 5 years. And the name on the top of the proposal? The Dolores Whitmore Community Reflection Fund. The announcement hit Cedar Pines like a low, unexpected hum. Not a bombshell, but a sound so unexpected, it made people pause. At first, everyone assumed it was a mistake, or satire, or some form of payback masked in mockery. But Shaq never flinched. When a reporter finally caught him leaving a rec center and asked why he would name it after someone who had tried to humiliate him, he gave the answer without blinking. Because change has to mean something. We can't erase what she did, but we can decide what we do with it. Let her name be a reminder, not of guilt, but of growth. The clip went viral within hours. Some praised the decision as profound grace. Others criticized it as passive. But none of them were the ones who had to live across the street from the person who once accused them of theft for standing in their own driveway. The following weekend, something else happened. Quietly, purposefully, flyers appeared across the neighborhood, hand-delivered rather than posted online. Unity Walk, Saturday at noon. No speeches, no chants, just presence, for our kids, for each other. There were no logos, no sponsorships. The starting point was the park. The route wound through the heart of Cedar Pines and ended at the elementary school playground, the same place where Mira and other kids had once been subtly excluded from playdates and birthday invitations. The day of the walk, the air held a crispness that hinted at spring, but hadn't quite let go of winter. Shaq arrived early, dressed in plain black, gloves tucked into his pockets. Mira stood beside him, holding a single placard. It read, "They're watching. Let's show them something better." People came slowly at first. Parents, teens, older couples. Nolan rolled up in his chair, flag attached to the back bearing the word justice in bold, clean font. By noon, nearly 200 residents stood at the park, silent, steady, uncertain. Then they walked. Not a protest, not a celebration. Just people, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to pretend anymore. No one shouted. No one clapped. The silence was the point. The sound of reflection, of regret, of possibility. As they passed Dolores's home, a hush settled even deeper. Curtains twitched. Her silhouette appeared behind the glass, watching the community she had once shaped, now move forward without her voice among them. There were no jeers, no glares, just stillness. But it cut deeper than any confrontation. Because silence doesn't always mean indifference. Sometimes, it means you're no longer invited to the conversation. Dolores didn't come outside. The walk ended at the school, where the kids played freely, all of them. No more whispered exclusions. No coded language, just squeals and sneakers on mulch. Mara joined without hesitation, her laughter echoing like a signal that something had shifted. Afterward, Shaq returned home. He didn't post a single photo. He didn't stand on a stage. He just made a pot of tea, sat on his porch, and watched as neighbors passed by. Some waving, some nodding, some still unsure what to say, but none looked away. Later that week, the Cedar Pines newsletter released its monthly edition. On the last page, where recipe swaps and community tips usually sat, was a new section titled Neighbor Spotlight. It featured a brief profile on Shaq, not about basketball, not about the scandal, but about the creation of the Reflection Fund and his commitment to community repair. Dolores's name wasn't mentioned, but the message was clear. In the following weeks, the tone across Cedar Pines began to shift. Mrs. Tran started a weekend story circle for local kids, multicultural tales, different languages, shared snacks. Linwood joined the new advisory council as a liaison for restorative accountability. Nolan worked with 2 teenagers to create an oral history project, documenting bias incidents and acts of neighborly resistance. People didn't forget what had happened, but they started choosing what to do with it. As for Dolores, she remained in her house, but she no longer attended HOA meetings, no longer hosted garden tours, or corrected teenagers walking across her lawn. The silence around her had shaped now, not cruel, but intentional. The woman who once shaped Cedar Pines through whispers and complaints now found herself surrounded by a different kind of quiet, one that didn't ask for her approval, only her absence. Shaq never gloated, never pointed. He just kept showing up for snow clearing, for PTA meetings, for Sunday park games, because his victory wasn't in headlines. It was in the way the next generation would grow up knowing how to respond to injustice. Not with vengeance, but with vision. The Big Shaq effect wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was slow, deliberate, and impossible to forget. A shift not just in how people acted, but how they saw one another. And in the melting snow, where once there had been suspicion, fear, and silence, there now lay footprints, side by side in every direction forward. The snowblower hadn't moved in weeks. Roxy, Once the roaring red beast that carved paths through winter and stirred quiet tension into confrontation, now rested silent and tucked away in the garage, her engine cool beneath a canvas cover. Spring was pressing its fingers into cedar pines, loosening the last of the icicles from eaves and turning snowdrifts into soft trickles running alongside sidewalks. The kind of melt that didn't make noise, just revealed what had always been buried underneath. In Shaq's front yard, just at the edge of his driveway, something new had appeared. A small black plaque, polished understated. It stood at knee height in a bed of early crocuses, their purple petals just beginning to open to the sun. The plaque read, "This driveway cleared by dignity, not approval."
No initials, no date, just a truth, etched permanent in metal, where the weather couldn't wash it away.
That morning, Mayra came downstairs wearing her cedar pine school hoodie, the same one she used to fold away in the bottom drawer after her classmates made her feel like a visitor in her own zip code. But now she wore it proud. She stepped out onto the porch with a banana in one hand and a notebook in the other. "Is it weird if I quote you in my civics essay?" she asked. Shaq looked up from the rose bush he was trimming. "I didn't say much to quote." "That's the point," she smiled. "You didn't have to. That's why I'm proud of you." He blinked, caught slightly off guard. "You did everything loud without ever yelling," she said. "And you didn't make it about revenge." Shaq stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his gloves. "I didn't want to make it about me, period." "Well," she said, stepping toward him and handing over the banana, "you kind of failed at that." He laughed deep and quiet, the kind that rumbled more than echoed. Behind them, across the street, Nolan Briggs was rolling down his driveway in his motorized chair, a reusable coffee mug clipped to the side. "You two better come help me plant these damn native grasses," he called out. "City says they help runoff, but I think they're just trying to trick us into accepting weeds." Shaq raised a hand in mock salute. "We'll be over in 20. "You better," Nolan replied. "Neighborhood needs its quiet storm." Mayra raised an eyebrow. "Quiet storm?" she asked, amused. "It's what he's been calling me since the town hall," Shaq explained. "Says I move slow but level everything when I land." She smiled again. "Could be worse. Could be Snowblower Man." He nodded toward the plaque. "At least Roxy gets her legacy." They spent the rest of the morning helping Nolan seed the runoff bed. Shaq handling the heavier lifting, Mara organizing tools, Nolan grumbling good-naturedly about government grants and HOA indecision. Other neighbors passed by, some stopping to help, others offering water or small waves, not tentative anymore, but real. The silence that used to hang thick in cedar pines, the one filled with unsaid things and sideways glances, had shifted. It was still quiet, but it wasn't afraid anymore. Now, it was the kind of quiet that followed understanding, the hush of a lesson taken seriously, not just heard, and it wasn't perfect. A few houses still shut their blinds. When Shaq walked past, some board members still resented the changes he and Nolan helped implement. And Dolores, though she hadn't moved, was rarely seen outdoors. No more HOA committees. No more porch chat. Just curtains. And distance. But Shaq didn't need her apology anymore. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was for the system that had protected her behavior to stop pretending it was neutral. That was the real victory. In the weeks that followed, the racial justice initiative he'd funded quietly took root. The Dolores Whitmore Community Reflection Fund, its name still raising eyebrows, began hosting small forums in libraries and schools. Muller attended the first youth council meeting and was asked to help lead the next one. Nolan's oral history project launched online with dozens of residents contributing first-hand accounts, some raw, some redemptive. The stories weren't just archived. They were read, discussed, printed, and posted in the school commons. Change didn't arrive like thunder. It came like thaw. The kind of warmth that didn't demand attention, but changed everything nonetheless. One evening, just after dinner, Shaq stepped onto the porch alone. The air was crisp but gentle, the kind of weather that tricked you into thinking summer might arrive early. Across the street, a new family was moving in. 2 women, 1 child, a dog that barked too much. They were greeted by 4 neighbors within the hour. One of them was Linwood, carrying a plate of brownies and a list of local babysitters. Shaq leaned against the porch railing and smiled. The neighborhood still had snow. There were still cold patches, icy edges, places that would take longer to warm. But the air had changed. The whispers were no longer about why he was here. They were about what he had done while he was, and the truth stayed, even as the snow faded. It stayed in the driveways that were now shoveled by teams, not individuals. It stayed in the stories passed between kids, who now asked why things happened the way they did. It stayed in a plaque, no bigger than a book, that told the whole story in one line. Peace, Shaq realized, was never about being right. It was about changing the weather inside people. And in Cedar Pines, for the first time in a long time, the forecast looked clear. What if the quietest moments reveal the loudest truths? If this story made you pause, question, or feel, don't let it stop here. Talk about it at your dinner table, challenge what normal looks like on your street, and listen harder. Because change doesn't always start with a protest. Sometimes it starts with a snowblower. Keep showing up. Keep asking better questions. That's how the story keeps going.